Welcome to our 7th episode of One Work, 5 Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I'm excited about today's topic.
War, yes.
Yeah. Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He's the editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and the author and editor of over 20 published books and over 100 essays on Jefferson. His list of books and locations of his published essays can be found in the video description. With our show, One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. Our 7th topic is Thomas Jefferson's views on war and query 22 from the Notes on Virginia. Now let's get started. First, I'll introduce you to our topic. Dr. Holowchak and I have talked personally and have some discussions, given the current state of global affairs, that is Russia's war with Ukraine, of Thomas Jefferson's views on war. Those indicated would be the subject of an upcoming book. Woohoo! He had indicated to me that Jefferson often wrote about war, but never in any one work. He made the subject the object of an exhaustive treatment. He mentioned that query 19 of Notes on Virginia would be as good as any writing to gain some grasp of what Jefferson thought about war, though the query would have to be supplemented by other writings. And so, with that in mind, we introduce our viewers today to Jefferson's views on war. Are you ready, Dr. Holowchak?
I'm ready. Seems like an appropriate topic for what's been going on for over a month in Europe and Ukraine.
Yeah, yes, it is. I like your flag.
Yeah, as you know, and maybe the viewers don't know, I am Ukrainian, so.
Very good. Question number 1, query 22 is titled Public Revenue and Expenses. While proffering an account on Virginia's money coming in and going out, Jefferson gives an account of the expense of war. Can you say something about that account?
In the query, refer to his book, he gives 2 main arguments. One is an argument from wasted effort, you might call it, and another is an argument from false arithmetic. Now he writes, let me read from the book. He says, young as we are and with such a country before us to fill with people and with happiness, we should point in that direction the whole generative force of nature, wasting none of its efforts in mutual destruction. It should be our endeavor to cultivate peace and friendship of every nation, even of that which has injured us most, when we shall have carried our point against her. Our interest will be to throw open the doors of commerce and to knock off all its shackles, giving perfect freedom to all persons for the vent of whatever they may choose to bring into our ports and asking none of theirs. Now, this argument, which I call the argument from wasted effort, it applies specifically to a young nation. When you are a jejune nation, you need, Jefferson thinks, to spend your efforts in internal growth, in addressing internal problem, in terms of populational growth and in terms of infrastructure like roads and things like that, educational institutions, and improving your internal, riddance of internal problems. So the argument of wasted effort is basically say, hey, we're a young country, let's get our stuff together and let's stay out of the broils of Europe and worry about more important issues like internal developments. Now, the second one is the more interesting of the arguments is this. He says, never was so much false arithmetic employed on any subject as that which has been employed to persuade nations that it is their interest to go to war, where the money which it has cost to gain at the close of a long war, a little town or little territory, the right to cut wood here or to catch fish there, expanded and improving what they already possess in making roads, opening rivers, as I talked about before, building ports, improving the arts, and finding employment for their idle poor. It would render them much stronger, much wealthier, much happier. This, I hope, will be our wisdom. Now, let me relate this to the goings on in Ukraine. I think we're seeing more than we've seen, perhaps in the history of the world, how Russia going into Ukraine, warring with Ukraine, has upset not only the economic balance of all of the world, but it's sort of having implications for the morality or the health of the whole world. Look at the fact that the wheat and is not being harvested in Russia and Ukraine, and it's not going to countries in northern Africa that need it. Everybody suffers, and he's making a sort of economic argument, but also I think a moral argument as well. But the predominant argument here is economic, that we could take this money that's being wasted. Imagine, okay, you go to war, again, go back to what Russia's doing. The whole world is suffering. Gas prices are up, food prices are skyrocketing. Some people are dying from lack of food and no water. Who's benefiting? Now, Russians might claim, well, Russia will gain key aspects of the Ukraine if things go well, or gain all of Ukraine at some point. But in some sense, they're going to they're damaging themselves, they're crippling themselves economically through sanctions, and which will probably be in effect for many, many years. So the idea here is the wisdom is and he makes fun of war. And I just want to bring that out. He says, look, why are we going to war? So we can cut wood here, catch fish there. At some point, it's so silly sometimes, some of the motivation for war. So those are the two main arguments that he proffers there.
I wonder how he would feel today, since we are no longer a young country, if he would still feel the same about war.
Tough question. Times certainly are different. We're not. We are a centralized government. We are a country that is massively, some $30 billion in debt, and I think he would sort of be disgusted by what he sees of our country today, and perhaps advocate revolution. Who knows what but it certainly he would not recognize. If he were brought to live in America today, he would not recognize the country and sort of be embarrassed. It's gone in that Hamiltonian direction that he certainly didn't like.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Holowchak. Question number 2. Jefferson then turns to abandoning the ocean altogether and turning wholly toward husbandry. Would that have been feasible? What here is his argument? Well,
after he gives these other two arguments, he starts talking. But Jefferson was always, pro-agrarianism. He wanted the country, especially in Notes on Virginia here, he wanted the country to move in the direction of husbandry. He hoped, because of the land that we had and the immensity of land and the small population, that we would explode our population and move to the west and to the north and south to some extent, and farm all this land and provide food for all the world. But he was pro-farming here. So the idea is that, let's abandon the oceans, namely, let's not have ships exporting goods and so forth. Let's just feed ourselves and feed the world. Let's create food for the world, so that if there be any ships in our ports, it'll be the foreign ships that come into our ports and take up our farm goods and bring to us what needed goods that we need. But the idea of not having our own ships of commerce on the Atlantic Ocean was for him to avoid the problem of impressment. Impressment was, the British Navy was so unbelievably large that they always had problems of having sailors for the ships. So they would stop ships at times and accuse certain men of having been in the British Navy and having escaped, and they would impress people to serve in the British Navy. So oftentimes the claims were spurious, but they needed. So you can't get in trouble if your ships are not on the sea, Jefferson thought. So let's just stay in isolation as far as we can from all of Europe. We won't get involved in their broils and their wars. Now at the end, he goes on and he says, okay, this would make us invulnerable to Europe by offering none of our property to their prize and would turn all our citizens to the cultivation of earth. And he says, cultivators of the earth are the most virtuous and independent citizens. But then he goes on to say, the actual habits of our countrymen attach them to commerce. They will exercise it for themselves. And he goes on to say, wars then must sometimes be our lot, and all the wise can do will be to avoid that half of them which would be produced by our own follies. Okay. So in other words, is that, well, what I just said is a wonderful ideal, but that's not what the American people want, right? They want to be engaged in commerce. They don't want to be exclusively involved in agriculture, especially the northern states. They want to produce goods which they can export, goods like whale oil and so forth that they can export to other countries that need them. Because of that, we're going to be embroiled in wars at times, whether we like it. So the best we can hope to do is just not be stupid about getting involved, not do anything ourselves to involve us in a war, to incite a war. The wars will come our way whether we like it or not. That's the ability of other countries.
Right. And we see that today, that it's not necessarily provoked by anyone. Question number 3. Okay, Jefferson then does acknowledge that war will be in some instances unavoidable, that the U.S. will sometimes be involved in wars. How, according to Jefferson, could we minimize the damage and escape the futility of wars for the young country?
Well, as I mentioned in the answer to the prior question, is that we just try not to involve ourselves in insults, try not to invoke the hostility of other nations by doing things stupid. But as he says, wars will be invariably be inevitable. So, we need to be ready. We need to have a militia that is ready. A militia not being a standing army, but we need to have our farmers and the people producing our goods to be ready to go to war if that happens. And we need a small navy for defensive purposes for the most part. So I collected a few quotes here to talk about, to try to answer more fully the question. Talk about minifying damage, escaping the futility or stupidity of war. So one is to be ready for it if it happens. But so it's going to happen at time. And to answer the question, was he a complete pacifist? No, he thought at times, if a country insults, I just have a couple quotes here without expatiation. He says, I think in our interest to punish the first insult, because an insult unpunished is the parent of many others. And let's go back to the Russian war with Ukraine. Now, Russia has been taking lands, in the past couple decades, and the idea is, well, they're doing a little bit, let's turn a blind eye to it. We don't want to involve ourselves. But then now, they've taken over the Crimea and other parts of Eastern Ukraine. And at some point, when do we punish? Jefferson's punished the first insult, because an insult unpunished is the parent. And we see that happening here. So Jefferson would have been on board with immediate action of some sense. And maybe the action he would have taken would have been just precisely the action that NATO countries are taking. He says to Henry Tazewell, 1795, it is an eternal truth that acquiescence under insult is not the way to escape war. Someone insults you, you say, okay, I'm gonna turn the other cheek, right? No, that invites further insults. He thinks that now, what of, I'm adding some stuff here because I'm trying to get a more complete picture. What of complicity during war without being war, like sharing weaponry, or having, like Russia is complicit. It has conscripts, non-Russian soldiers fighting in the war. Jefferson says in a letter to Sir Guy Carleton in 1777, he says, "He who employs another to do a deed makes the deed his own." Right. So in other words, if I call on someone to I pay someone to assassinate or murder somebody, I am the murderer. So in some sense, this invites us to consider complicity, different ways of being complicit during war, sending weapons to help the Ukrainians, having conscripts in the Russian army and so forth. Another way of softening, and this is a tremendously important point, Jefferson thought of humane treatment for prisoners of war. When he was governor, he had many of the Hessian prisoners, thousands of prisoners, moved to Charlottesville in a prison camp that, and Jefferson had, many don't know this, but he had many of the who would now be German, soldiers, ranking soldiers, over to Monticello to play music with him, to dine with him and drink wine with him. He was on friendly terms with these, lifelong friendships with some of the officers in the Hessian, among the Hessian troops. So he writes to Patrick Henry in 1799, let me read this quote: "Is an enemy so execrable that though in captivity his wishes and comforts are to be disregarded and even crossed? I think not. It is for the benefit of mankind to mitigate, to soften the horrors of war as much as possible. The practice, therefore, of modern nations of treating captive enemies with politeness and generosity is not only delightful in contemplation, but really interesting to all the world, friends, foes, and neutrals." Jefferson is at the forefront, like Immanuel Kant, and he even says in one letter, I think in the same letter, that this is proof that we are improving morally over the years, where captives would be tortured, they still are today in many places, tortured savagely and brutally, murdered at times. Here, Jefferson believes in humane treatment for captives, and he practiced what he preached. So, those are some of the things he advocated in practice when it came to mitigating or militating against some of the horrors of war.
Okay, question number 4. What then of the Revolutionary War? The colonists did instigate that war, did they not?
Yeah, this is not a war. This is not a defensive war. This is a war that the colonists began in some measure. I mean, the colonists in their defense would say it was instigated, as Jefferson says in his declaration, and 2 years before that, in his summary view of the rights of British America, that there has been a long train of abuses at the hands of George III. Taxation without representation, where he's abusing the privileges of the colonists to fund his war with France, the Amaranthine War with France. So this was not a defensive war, as you say, and Jefferson fully supported. I'm going to read you one quote that I like. It sort of was the inducement for me to want to write a book on Jefferson and war, and it is written to John Wales Epps. He says, "If ever there was a holy war, it was that which saved our liberties and gave us independence. The war of the Revolution will be sanctioned by the approbation, the approval of posterity through all future ages." He calls the Revolutionary War a holy war. Jefferson held, as we've talked of before, the concept of liberty, of freedom in such high regard. It's a holy war. Humans are, he thinks, by nature, freedom-loving animals, and there can be no human happiness without maximal liberty.
Mhm.
Now, as many people at the time said, government was a necessary evil. It's not a good thing. It's a bad thing because it constricts our liberties. But if we're going to live in large social gatherings, we need to have constriction of liberties to some extent. So the greatest government, thought Jefferson, was that government which allowed for maximal exercise, actualization of our liberties. And so government staying out. So it was a holy war. It was a war, and I keep thinking about this over and over, this concept of liberty. He was the greatest, in my estimation, adherent of the whole concept of liberty of anyone in his day. Even the French liberals at the time were, I think, in my estimation, very much motivated by Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
Mhm.
So this whole concept of this being a holy war, he's fighting on behalf of human nature.
Mhm.
Humans are by nature free, and they have not been free for centuries because free people have been enslaved for centuries, for millennia, by oppressive government, by kings, by aristocratical governments, and so forth, that act in their own interest and not in the interest of the general citizenry. So calls it a holy war. I think, it's, and he hoped that the French Revolution would be modeled on it, and there would be, as there was after the American Revolution, there were revolutions all over the globe
Mhm.
in the interest of liberty. But if we don't understand just what liberty is and what Jefferson meant, people can use the concept of liberty for justification for any sort of revolution. But one has to be careful. Again, going back to his declaration, let me just add, and this as well. He said it's very dangerous to think to go through a sanguinary, a bloody revolution, as Hamilton wanted. Hamilton said the English Constitution is the greatest thing with all its imperfections. You change the imperfections, you imperfect it. So.
Right.
And Jefferson said, how ridiculous to fight a war, a revolutionary war, and then just bring in the British Constitution the way it is, right? It's the British Constitution that coerced us, that constricted us and taxed us. We needed something better.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to make the fight worth it. Question number 5. Finally, to turn to a related topic, I have always been intrigued by Jefferson's letters on Shays' Rebellion. They have been heavily criticized by contemporaries like the Adamses and contemporary scholars, have they not?
They sure have.
How does Jefferson's defense of the bloody efforts of rebellionists square with the republicanism?
Well, he was in France during Shays' Rebellion, which was, maybe we'll make that the topic of another discussion down the road, but it was a rebellion mainly of Massachusetts farmers, but it's a rebellion that spread into other states. And in many respects, it was an understandable and just, and James Adams said, that it was understandable at least. He said, I have a quote from him. He said, well, there was laid on a tax rather heavier than the people could bear, but all will be well, and this commotion will terminate in additional strength. The government said, that's not what what Adams would say later on. He would have some rather nasty thoughts on what Jefferson had to say. But Jefferson, so it was a rebellion. You can understand why it was fought. Many farmers who fought in the Revolutionary War were promised money for the war and not paid upon that money upon coming back to their farms after serving the country. And in some cases, like in the case of Shays, they wanted to take his land away from him for non-payment of taxations and things like that. And it's ridiculous. Fight a war, and this is how you reward me. You don't pay me, and then you want to take over my land. So you can see how people would be. Now, the problem was it was a very bloody rebellion to some extent, and people who lived near the rebellion were in fear of their lives. And let me read, Jefferson's reaction in France was positive. He writes, I have some letters from 1787, one to Edward Carrington. He says, there's a bad scene here, but the proper corrective is to give them full information of their affairs through free presses. The way to solve this is to have free presses so they know what they're doing before they act. And he goes on to say, if I were given the choice between a government without newspapers and newspapers without government, I would prefer the latter. So important are newspapers. I'd rather have newspapers than government if I can only have one or the other. Now to James Madison, he writes, I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. He says it's a medicine that is necessary for sound health of government. So if we're going to publish rebellionists, the punishments often and always ought to be mild. To William Stephen Smith in the same year, he says, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. It's not much days. The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. It's a very strange quote because he is saying oftentimes people inciting and participating in rebellions not going to have all the facts and going to be rebelling for bad reasons. But even then, he says it's all right because it's better to have a few bad rebellions than it is to have no rebellions at all.
Okay.
Now, that's a weird comment. Why, bloody people dying and all that, it's better to have that than have none. He thought, and he says, I think in the letter to Madison, it's always better to have some turbulence than to have quiet servitude. Thomas taught this. So quiet servitude means, submission to coercive government. Look what goes on in Russia today, where the people are spoon-fed propaganda and they think it's news. Where, they're not giving different points of view. There's no free press. So, there's a problem that you have when you have a free government. Like we notice, we have corruption in our elections. We have, because we have free presses. We have terribly free presses because we have two viewpoints, and this is why I watch Al Jazeera and I don't even listen to American news sources because they're biased, and I'm just tired of the biases. I want to get a more disinterested point of view. But nonetheless, Jefferson was saying, that was the case in his day as well. You had biased presses. To him, it's still better because you can even propagandize if you want. You're free to propagandize. He always thought the truth would come out in the end. There's no guarantee of that. But so this whole notion of having rebellions every now and again was, you have your. Can you give us your Tree of Liberty quote that you love so much?
The Tree of Liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's its natural manure.
Natural manure, again, a very strange quote, and he was crucified for that, for having stated that. But it's just, when he talks about in the letter to Madison and other letters, he talks about the notion of different types of governments without laws, governments with too many laws that you see in France, where the king is absolute or something, and absolutist governments, and governments with as many laws as there are needed. Republican government that he's envisaging like his own. The idea is there have to be some laws. There can't be government without laws, but you don't want too many laws. You want only as many as you need. And when you have few laws, and Jefferson will go on to say we can talk about the goodness or strength of a government by the number of its laws. If it has a lot of laws, you can assure yourself it's corrupt. Fewer laws, less corrupt. When you have free government, you're going to have problems. You're going to have rebellions. You're going to have pockets of discontent, and you're going to have to deal with it. But Jefferson thinks it's a good thing it's a sign, and I in some sense agree, it's a sign that people are still interested in what's going on in the government. They're not content with saying, do whatever you want to do. Let me just go to my job, make my money, and watch my MTV. Let me watch Oprah reruns and eat Hostess Ding Dongs all day long. People are still interested as long as they're getting angry, even if they're getting angry for the wrong reason. So I agree with that. I don't know what your take is on that, but I agree with that. It's a sign that people are still, in some sense, alive and concerned with what's going on.
Yeah.
So I mean, so I can sum, if I can, that Jefferson was no pacifist. He believed there needed to be war in some cases, especially when people are abusing your rights. If rights are being abused, the Holy War, the Revolutionary War, it's fought on behalf of human rights. This is a great war. This is an important war. And in other cases, like in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you'd certainly say Ukrainians and NATO allied countries are within the rights to fight back and not allow Russia, to go in and do whatever it seems to do. Wasn't a pacifist, but he was a moralist when it came to war. He wanted to militate for reforms to make the effects of war less opprobrious for people suffering through war.
Right.
That's it. I mean, there's more I can say. When I start writing my book, I'll have more.
Oh, that was a hint, hint, hint. There's another Jefferson book coming out.
Yeah, I'm still immersed in the one. As you know, I'm working on a sort of counterfactual novel called A World Without Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, A World Without Thomas Jefferson.
That's a lot of fun. I mean, people ask me, well, how can you write 20 books on Jefferson and, still be motivated to write more? He was a brilliant person. He was a person who immersed himself in so many different things. It's easy to, I'm a person, I don't share his brilliancy, but I'm a person that had studied so many different things. And like he has, I love language, I love philology, I love all the different sciences. I'm in love with knowledge, I'm in love with language. And how can you not be fascinated by this person? So
there's so much to learn.
It really is. I mean, I called you months ago as a TEDx person like Jefferson, someone who's interested in learning. There's so much to learn. And when you find someone who gets excited about learning, it's exciting, it's infectious. That's why he's just a wonderful person.
Yeah.
It flabbergasts me that people are crucifying him and racist, hypocrite and all that. One of the most fascinating people in his day on the planet, and yet the way historians treat of him today, it's criminal. I hope these historians have they get their punishment at the end of the day.
Yeah, it truly is. He doesn't deserve this at all.
Obsolescence would be the appropriate punishment to have these critics, and I think it will happen decades from now. The people who are writing this inflammatory, gossipy bullshit will be cast off into oblivion. I do believe that. And the people running Monticello won't be as well. I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you, Donna, for
thank you. So I'd like to tell everyone a little bit about our next episode. As Dr. Holowchak noted in today's discussion, Jefferson mentions in Query 22 that cultivators of the earth are the most virtuous and independent citizens, the most significant element in a Jeffersonian republic. For the next One Work, 5 Questions, we'll stay in Jefferson's notes on Virginia and cover his love and patronage of husbandry in Query 19. I'm excited.
Well, that'll follow neatly. We had the quote, did we not? Cultivators of earth are the most, what does he say? The most blessed by God, or something like. He really loved and as I'll inform readers, my first published paper on Jefferson was on Jefferson and husbandry. So
oh wow, we'll have to include that in.
Soft spot in my heart. And then I too love growing things. How can you not love putting a seed in the ground and watching what happens? It's so cool. It's nothing short of a miracle. It's wonderful to be able to.
It is, and I'm glad that we can share this Jefferson's passion with this. we see it today in what's happening with our food shortages, and how important it would be if we could cultivate our own food, how much better off we would be as a society.
People will be doing that increasingly, is my guess, with the high prices of foods.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If you would like to schedule Dr. Holowchak at your business, college, school, organization, you can reach him at mholowchak@hotmail.com, or his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change.
At your
Thank you.
bachelorette party or whatever, right?
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your great knowledge on Thomas Jefferson.
It's a pleasure. Like you said, Jefferson said, when you talk about ideas, the wonderful thing about sharing knowledge or ideas is that when if I share a pie with you, I give you part of what I have and have part. If I share an idea with you, or if we share ideas, you give me everything you have and I retain it in its fullness. And I too give you everything I have and you retain it in its fullness. So the exchange of ideas, Jefferson even knows, such a wonderful thing. It makes life, getting out of bed, worth doing. Thank you for having me, and we'll do this again, next Sunday? Same
Yes.
time, bat channel?
Yeah, same bat time, same bat channel.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.